90 seconds. 90 seconds that would end a political career and crystallize everything wrong with American socialism in the eyes of Middle America. When Vice President J.D. Vance stepped to the microphone at the National Governors Association meeting, nobody expected the verbal execution that was about to unfold. Zohran Mamdani had spent months positioning himself as the voice of America's progressive future, the young mayor who would lead the socialist revolution from New York to the heartland. But in 90 seconds of surgical precision, the former venture capitalist turned vice president would remind everyone why socialism has never taken root in American soil, and why politicians who bet their careers on it always end up as cautionary tales. The confrontation had been building since Mamdani's election victory. Behind closed doors in Washington, Republican strategists had been salivating at the prospect of having a self-proclaimed socialist running America's largest city. "This guy is political gold," Steve Bannon had told Trump during a Mar-a-Lago strategy session. "Every time he opens his mouth, we win votes in Ohio." But it was J.D. Vance, with his unique biography as someone who had lived in both worlds, the struggling Rust Belt and the elite coasts, who understood exactly how to weaponize Mamdani's radicalism against the entire Democratic Party. The setting was perfect for political theater. The National Governors Association winter meeting in Washington brought together the most powerful state executives in the country. Mamdani, as mayor of the nation's largest city, had been invited to speak about urban policy challenges. But what was supposed to be a routine panel on infrastructure funding became the stage for one of the most devastating political takedowns in recent memory. Mamdani had been riding high on national progressive acclaim. His confrontations with Trump, his defiance of moderate Democrats, his unwavering commitment to socialist principles, all of it had made him a hero to the activist left and a frequent guest on MS. He arrived in Washington confident that his message of revolutionary change would resonate even among moderate governors who were struggling with similar urban challenges. The panel discussion had proceeded normally for the first hour. Governors from both parties discussed federal funding formulas, infrastructure needs, and regulatory challenges. Mamdani had presented his vision for democratically controlled economic planning and argued that traditional capitalism was fundamentally incompatible with addressing climate change and inequality. Several Democratic governors had nodded politely while Republican governors took notes, not for policy purposes, but for opposition research. Then Vice President Vance was invited to offer closing remarks. What happened next would be replayed on conservative media for months and become a defining moment in the broader debate over socialism in America. Vance began innocuously enough, thanking the governors for their service and acknowledging the challenges facing American cities. But there was something in his tone, a sharpness, a precision, that suggested this wasn't going to be a typical political pleasantry. The Ohio native, who had risen from poverty to the Naval Academy to Yale Law School to the venture capital world before entering politics, understood better than most politicians how to speak to working-class Americans who felt abandoned by elite institutions. "I want to address something I heard earlier from Mayor Mamdani," Vance said, his voice carrying across the hushed conference room, "because I think it perfectly illustrates why socialism has failed every time it's been tried and why it will always fail in America." The room tensed immediately. This wasn't the usual political back and forth. This was going to be a direct ideological assault. Mamdani shifted uncomfortably in his chair, suddenly realizing he was about to become the target of a very public political execution. Mayor Mamdani talked about democratically controlled economic planning, Vance continued, his voice taking on the prosecutorial tone that had made him famous during Senate hearings. "That's a fancy way of saying government bureaucrats should decide how your money gets spent instead of you. It's the same promise socialists have made from Venezuela to Detroit, that experts in distant capitals know better than working families how to improve their lives." The first blow landed perfectly. By linking Mamdani's policies to Venezuela's economic collapse and Detroit's bankruptcy, Vance had immediately placed progressive politics in the context of failure rather than aspiration. But he was just getting started. "I grew up in Ohio, in communities where people work with their hands and worry about making payroll," Vance said, his biography becoming part of his political weapon. And you know what I've never heard in all my years in those communities? I've never heard a single working person say, gee, I wish the government controlled more of the economy. What I hear is, I wish the government would get out of the way so I can build something for my family. The personal touch was devastating because it contrasted Vance's authentic working class background with Mamdani's elite progressive activism. Here was a vice president who had actually lived the struggles that Mamdani claimed to understand only through ideological theory. But it was what came next that would define the entire exchange and create the soundbite that would haunt Mamdani for the rest of his political career. The mayor talks about revolutionary change, Vance said, his voice rising with controlled passion. But here's what he doesn't understand about America. We already had our revolution. It was called capitalism, and it created the most prosperous, most free, most generous nation in human history. What he's proposing isn't revolution, it's regression to the failed systems that Americans have been fleeing from for centuries. The rhetorical move was brilliant. Rather than defending capitalism as the status quo, Vance had reframed it as America's revolutionary achievement, making socialism the reactionary force trying to drag the country backward. Every single time socialism has been tried, it has produced the same results. Vance continued, his timing perfect, as he built toward his crescendo. Economic stagnation, political oppression, and ordinary people suffering while elites maintain their power. Cuba, Venezuela, the Soviet Union, the same pattern every time. And now Mayor Mamdani wants to bring that failure to New York City, and then to America. Mamdani tried to interject, but Vance held up his hand and delivered the knockout blow that would become the most quoted political moment of the year. This is exactly why America rejects socialism, Vance declared, his voice carrying the authority of his office and the passion of his convictions. Because Americans understand something that elite progressives don't. Freedom and prosperity go hand in hand. You can't have one without the other. And when politicians promise you can vote your way to prosperity by taking other people's property, they're selling you the same lie that has impoverished billions of people around the world. The silence that followed was deafening. In 90 seconds, Vance had systematically dismantled not just Mamdani's policy proposals, but the entire intellectual framework of American socialism. He had done it not with wonky statistics or arcane economic theory, but with the kind of plain-spoken common sense that resonated with exactly the voters Democrats needed to win back in swing states. Mamdani's attempt at a response was politically catastrophic. Flustered and clearly unprepared for such a direct ideological challenge, he fell back on the progressive talking points that worked well in Brooklyn, but sounded hollow in a room full of governors dealing with real-world problems. The vice president's comments reflect the same tired capitalist propaganda that has kept working people down for decades. Mamdani began, his voice betraying his nervousness. What we're seeing across America is the failure of a system that prioritizes profits over people, that allows billionaires to accumulate obscene wealth while children go hungry. The response was exactly what Vance had hoped for, a collection of progressive cliches that proved his point about elite detachment from ordinary American concerns. But Mamdani wasn't finished making things worse for himself. The vice president talks about freedom. But what freedom is there for a worker who can't afford healthcare? What freedom is there for a family that can't afford housing in their own neighborhood? What freedom is there when democracy itself is purchased by the highest bidder? The questions might have been effective in a college classroom or a progressive rally, but in a room full of practical politicians dealing with budget constraints and voter expectations, they sounded like academic theorizing divorced from political reality. Vance didn't even need to respond. The contrast between his concrete, historically grounded critique and Mamdani's abstract complaints about inequality spoke for itself. Several governors were already reaching for their phones, no doubt preparing to share clips of the exchange with their communication team. The immediate aftermath was brutal for Mamdani and catastrophic for progressive politics more broadly. Conservative social media exploded with clips of Vance's takedown, with the "This is why America rejects socialism" soundbite becoming an instant meme. Within hours, America Rejects Socialism was trending nationally, with thousands of users sharing their own stories about fleeing socialist countries or succeeding under capitalism. But the real damage came from an unexpected source: moderate Democrats, who felt that Mamdani's poor performance had vindicated their concerns about progressive overreach. 3 Democratic governors who had been present for the exchange privately told reporters that Vance had made some good points about the dangers of socialist rhetoric. A senior Democratic strategist was quoted anonymously saying that Mamdani had walked into a trap that hurt the entire party. The media coverage was devastating. Even outlets generally sympathetic to progressive causes acknowledged that Vance had dominated the exchange. CNN's panel of analysts unanimously agreed that the vice president had delivered a masterclass in political communication. MSNBC host Chris Hayes admitted that Vance had effectively weaponized American political culture against socialist arguments in a way that will be hard to counter. Conservative media, meanwhile, was in full celebration mode. Fox News ran Vance's comments on loop, with Sean Hannity declaring it the moment socialism died in America. Tucker Carlson devoted an entire segment to analyzing how Vance had exposed the intellectual bankruptcy of the American left. Right-wing podcasters and YouTube channels generated millions of views by breaking down the exchange second by second. But perhaps most damaging of all was the reaction from ordinary Americans, particularly in the swing states that would determine future elections. Focus groups conducted in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Michigan showed that Vance's comments had reinforced exactly the concerns about Democratic overreach that had hurt the party in previous elections. Working-class voters who might have been sympathetic to progressive economic policies were turned off by what they saw as Mamdani's radical rhetoric and poor defense of his positions. The political implications extended far beyond Mamdani himself. Republican operatives immediately began incorporating Vance's talking points into campaigns across the country. GOP candidates in 2026 House and Senate races started using "This is why America rejects socialism" as a rallying cry, often accompanied by clips of Mamdani's stumbling response. Democratic candidates found themselves forced to distance themselves from progressive rhetoric that had become politically toxic thanks to Mamdani's poor performance. Behind the scenes, Democratic leadership was furious. Nancy Pelosi reportedly told colleagues that Mamdani had handed Republicans their best talking point in years. Chuck Schumer was said to be livid that a single mayor's ideological inflexibility had created problems for Democrats in competitive races across the country. Even progressive leaders like Bernie Sanders and AOC began quietly distancing themselves from Mamdani's most radical rhetoric. The long-term consequences for Mamdani's career were swift and severe. Within a week of the Vance exchange, 3 major Democratic fundraising networks announced they would no longer support candidates who embraced economically destructive socialist policies. Union leaders who had previously supported Mamdani began questioning whether his radical positions were hurting their members' interests. Most devastating of all, progressive activists started arguing that Mamdani's poor advocacy was actually harming the causes they all claimed to support. A month after the confrontation, internal Democratic polling showed that association with Mamdani had become a net negative for progressive candidates nationwide. The mayor, who had once been hailed as the future of American progressivism, was now seen as a political liability whose very name conjured images of economic radicalism and policy extremism. For J.D. Vance, the exchange became a defining moment that elevated his national profile and demonstrated his effectiveness as a conservative communicator. Republican donors began talking about him as a potential presidential candidate, praising his ability to articulate conservative principles in language that appealed to working-class voters. The kid from Ohio who had written about America's forgotten communities had shown he could defend their values against elite progressive condescension. But beyond the immediate political implications, the exchange had revealed something deeper about American political culture. Vance had tapped into a fundamental skepticism about top-down economic planning that runs deep in American DNA. His invocation of historical failures, Venezuela, Cuba, the Soviet Union, had reminded Americans why their ancestors had come to the New World in the first place, to escape exactly the kind of centralized control that Mamdani was advocating. The 90-second destruction was more than just a political moment. It was a cultural teachable moment about the enduring appeal of American individualism versus collective control. And in that battle, Mamdani had chosen the wrong side of American history. As one conservative commentator put it in the aftermath, J.D. Vance didn't just destroy Zohran Mamdani. He destroyed the entire socialist project in America. And he did it in less time than it takes to make a cup of coffee. The revolution that Mamdani had promised never came. Instead, 90 seconds of cold political reality had reminded everyone why it never would.